second nature, the soft gray matter that built a civilization. Pourable premixed concrete. Once upon a time zone, a poor lonely prince lived in a tiny dungeon in the sky, above even Jack's beanstalk. This prince was very handsome and terribly clever and marvelously modest. He wore a powerful talisman, and he had many magic crystal cubes and a nano-cybernetic 3000 computer named Nancy. With Nancy's help, the prince spent 5 years making annoying clicking sounds on his talisman, which would summon up wizards and seers. These wizards made gold by spinning words into stories. The prince loved these tales because they helped him forget his own sad story. But the poor prince could never really forget, because once every 7 days, the cruel Nancy would replay his story to remind him of how he had embarked on a great journey and become trapped in a metal prison.
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick. Newsweek magazine recently reported that Golden Books plan to publish sanitized versions of classic fairy tales. Well, they won't be the first to try to remove the violence and terror from Hans Christian Andersen's 19th century fairy tales, or the Germanic folklore recorded by the Brothers Grimm in the early 1800s, or tales like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, which Charles Perrault collected in 17th century France. But wait till they see the new fairy tale novels by dark fantasy writers like Peter Straub, Jane Yolen, and Clive Barker, or the S&M version of Sleeping Beauty from Anne Rice, or the exciting new comic book project from Neil Gaiman and Charles Vess. Charles, I heard you and Neil Gaiman are working on a modern fairy tale comic called Stardust, and I loved your illustrated version of Little Red Riding Hood. Why do you find fairy tales so fascinating?
Well, don't know. It's, the thing I like about fairy tales is that stories are written by an entire nation instead of one person, and they've been honed over hundreds of years to apply to the psychology of all those people. And they have really interesting mythic qualities, but I'm not someone that sits down and analyzes things. I like to read it, respond to it, and draw on it. But I'm not. If I analyze it too much, I get bored. I've thought it out in my head, and it looks great in my head. And why should I put it on a piece of paper?
All right, I can see that. Do you have a favorite fairy tale?
Probably one of yes.
Okay.
It's it's about a page and a half long. Very succinct. I like this one. Maybe a little too moral, but it's about a bad little girl who's done all these bad things, and her mom doesn't like her and sends her off to do an errand for her, and she goes up to old Granny Goodwitch or something's door and knocks on it, and she's going to play some kind of trick on Granny Goodwitch, and Granny comes to the door and goes, "You're a bad little girl," takes her and turns her into a fire log and throws her in the fire. The end.
Nice story, Charles. Real nice.
So I've always been a good little boy.
Yeah, I'll bet. That wonderful fairy tale tradition of young children being horribly, horribly punished can be found in Clive Barker's novel, The Thief of Always. Harvey Swick is a bored young hooligan scared straight by the horrors he encounters at Holiday House. You see, Holiday House is a magical place that promises summer all year round. But the moral of the story is that there's a terrible price to be paid for avoiding winter. And Clive ought to know. He lives in L.A. Did the darkness of the fairy tales that you read as a kid have a big effect on you?
I was affected by fairy tales immensely, strongly, in all forms. I mean, whether it be the Disney form or whether it be Andrew Lang's fairy books or whether it be retellings of various kinds. At the heart of so many fairy tales is darkness. Grandmothers are eaten by wolves.
Right.
Little girls are in constant terror. Little boys are fattened up by witches. And they're the happy tales. Yes, there is happily ever after, but there are usually terrors to be encountered before you get to that line, to that moment. I think that reflects two things. I think it firstly reflects the social conditions of the time when those tales were written, and we should remember these are actually ancient tales being constantly retold and eventually set down in the 18th and 19th centuries in sometimes very vulgarized forms. I mean, you know, the original tales may be even bloodier and crueler than the things that we receive, the tales we receive. The second thing is that I think children's lives are very often grimmer and darker and more disturbed and disturbing than Steven Spielberg would have us believe. Certainly going back as a 40-year-old and examining my life as a 10-year-old, I recalled a lot, and this is not about abuse or anything like that. My parents were loving, kind people, but I remember intense rage and powerlessness, and I think, and fear. Fear that I didn't comprehend the forces that were operating upon me.
I just read your essay, Cinderella's Revenge, about the influence that fairy tales have had on Stephen King's fiction. And I wondered what you thought of fairy tales in general.
Well, as my librarian friend calls them, pornography for kids, yes. I think that they are, I think most of them are very grim. And I think that you do them a disservice when you make them less grim, because they deal with the real issues that frighten children. And they give them a tool against fear. I mean, just like horror fiction is for adults, is a tool against fear. If you make the thing that you're afraid of trivialized, it says your fear is foolish. And it's, you know, not that you should let fear overwhelm you, but, you know, don't kid yourself. There are things that are very bad and dangerous, and you have to know that these things cannot be glossed over. And I think, in fact, a lot of kids find it reassuring to have people respect the fact that these things frighten them. I think we have a tendency to assume, oh, it's just a, you know, it's just a little kid's fear. They're just afraid of the dark, or they're just afraid of the big kid down the street. Well, maybe they have very good reason to be afraid of the dark, and maybe the big kid down the street has been hassling him.
Childhood fears and fairy tales are recurring themes in Stephen King's work. Carrie combines the ugly duckling with a sinister Cinderella. Johnny, the psychic hero of The Dead Zone, strongly resembles the Grimm brothers' character of Faithful John, who sacrifices himself to save the prince. But King's purest fairy tale novel is The Eyes of the Dragon. Here, the muddling monarch Roland is murdered by his Machiavellian magician Flag. This sinister sorcerer then turns Prince Peter and his brother against each other in a struggle for truth, justice, and the throne itself. King wrote The Eyes of the Dragon for his daughter, but it's a perfect example of a fairy tale for adults. And my friends in Control caught up to another master of modern horror, Peter Straub. Peter took a cutting from The Juniper Tree, a classic Grimm brothers tale, and he transplanted it and watered it and pruned it until the juniper tree took root in his imagination and sprouted in his novel, The Throat.
Once on the near south side of town, a band of children killed a stranger, dismembered him, and buried the pieces of his body beneath a juniper tree. And later, the divided and buried parts of the body began to call out to each other. Once a rich old man raped his daughter and kept her imprisoned in a room where she raved and drank, without ever remembering what had happened to her. Once the pieces of the murdered man buried beneath the juniper tree called out and caused the children to bring them together. Once a dead man was wrongly accused of terrible crimes. And once, when the parts of the dismembered man were brought together at the foot of the tree, the whole man rose and spoke, alive again, restored.
What do you find so compelling about the juniper tree fairy tale?
It's a metaphor for healing, I think. It's about the survival of catastrophe. It's about what is learned from trauma, I think. And what I like about it is that really it ends with resurrection, you could say.
And when you were researching the juniper tree, how did you go about doing that, the original fairy tale?
Oh, I've always been interested in the Brothers Grimm. A long time ago, I bought a complete Grimm, and later I bought other editions. There was once an edition of the Grimm stories called The Juniper Tree, I think edited by Marie Sendak. A friend of my son's, at the time the boys were about 10, came up to me one day and said, you know, I think The Juniper Tree is my favorite story. And so I read it again, and then I think I forgot it. But I remembered the essential parts. So my version of the juniper tree is really my version. It's not the real thing, but it's about what speaks to me in that story.
Peter retold another German fairy tale in his novel Shadowland. Here it's Goethe's classic fable, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. That's the pre-Mickey version. A few days ago, I logged onto internet and solicited some suggestions for modern fantasy authors who tackled fairy tales. One name kept cropping up again and again, Angela Carter. Up until her death in 1992, Carter combined a robust imagination with a vivid vocabulary to produce vulgar and voluptuous visions. In her collection, The Bloody Chamber, she rewrote classics like Puss in Boots and Little Red Riding Hood in her own saucy and sensual style. And as the editor of the Virago Book of Fairy Tales, Carter put a feminist spin on the fairy tale form by collecting stories featuring clever women and resourceful girls. And the grand mistress of modern vampire fiction, A.N. Roquelaure, better known as Anne Rice, has taken a new position on the Sleeping Beauty story. Here it takes more than a kiss to arouse the slumbering princess. Why did you decide to take a children's fairy tale and turn it into sadomasochistic erotica?
It was all spontaneous and instinctive. I don't have any idea. Very much the idea was to make a safe place for people to enjoy a fantasy, to write something that was the opposite of grim and gruesome and revoltingly full of literal violence, to take people away from that into a fairy tale land where they could have permission to enjoy their fantasies in return. And they knew nobody was going to get nailed to the wall or branded or any ugly thing like that was going to happen. And I believed S&M could be like that it could be like a fairy tale land, and you could enjoy that fantasy and explore it and come back and be fine. And that was my idea.
But isn't part of what made your trilogy work so well the subtext of fear that's in all fairy tales, that it's not all innocent?
Well, I was certainly aware of that, you know, that there's a lot of sensuality and terror and subtext in fairy tales. There's a lot. But the more I read fairy tales, the more I think they don't make any sense at all. I mean, I've actually studied quite a few, you know, and gone through anthologies and books of fairy tales, and one of the scary things about them as a genre is they're not really a genre. There's no pattern, and there's certainly no moral sense governing them. I mean, horrible things happen to people in fairy tales, just absurd things. And whatever they are, they're certainly worth study, but they're not consistently one thing or another.
Perhaps one of the reasons so many modern writers are drawn to update fairy tales is to add that moral sense. Take author Jane Yolen, one of the biggest advocates of the fairy tale form. Jane edits the Xanadu anthologies, which collect brand new fairy tales by the likes of Ursula K. Le Guin, Nancy Kress, Martha Sukup, and Tanith Lee. And Jane's also written Touch Magic, a book of essays on fairy tales and children's literature. And she was a Nebula Award finalist and World Fantasy Award finalist for Briar Rose, her novel which puts Sleeping Beauty on Schindler's List. Talk about adding a moral sense to a story. Control asked Jane to read an excerpt from Briar Rose, where Gemma reads a bedtime story to her granddaughters.
Once upon a time, Gemma began, the older two girls whispering the opening with her, which is all times and no times, but not the very best of times. There was a castle, and in it lived a king who wanted nothing more in the world than a child. From your lips to God's ears, the queen said each time the king talked of a baby. But the years went by, and they had none. None, 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 sang out Rebecca, banging her spoon on the cup with each word. Shut up, Shana and Sylvia said in unison. Gemma took the spoon and cup away and gave Rebecca a slice of apple instead. Now, one day, finally and at last, and about time, the queen went to bed and gave birth to a baby girl with a crown of red hair. Gemma touched her own hair, in which strands of white curled around the red like barbed wire. The child's face was as beautiful as a wild flower, and so the king named her Briar Rose, Sylvia and Shana breathed. Briar Rose, repeated Rebecca, only not nearly so clearly, her mouth being quite full of apple.
Later, Control asked Jane why there have been so many different versions of the Sleeping Beauty story.
Well, a good story calls all of us who consider ourselves storytellers, and it says, tell me again, and if you want to make it your own, you keep the core of the story, but you add something to it. You add what it is that's bothering you at that time. And for me, clearly it was, at this point, Holocaust material that I needed to deal with. But because the main story is so strong, the embellishments become what you can add to it. And sometimes those embellishments are humor, sometimes those embellishments are pathos, sometimes those embellishments are real tragedy.
How difficult was it to integrate Sleeping Beauty and a story about the Holocaust?
Well, actually, it wasn't that difficult because I began with the idea that there was an actual concentration camp in a castle called Chelmno. That's where the whole idea began. And I knew that they also used gas on the people who were there. So you had that mist coming down and putting everyone to sleep, and the barbed wire being the fence or the hedge. So the key elements of that story were in place before I actually began it. The trouble was, as I went on, there were more and more elements that were there already. I had never realized it. And it all dovetailed in a way that was amazing to me.
And to readers. Briar Rose proves the power of the original fairy tale structures. Jane also went back to the original version of Cinderella, the one where the wicked stepsisters cut off their toes to try to fit into the glass slipper, for her poem, Knives. You'll find Knives in the anthology Snow White Blood Red, edited by Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow. Unlike Jane Yolen's Xanadu collections, which showcase new stories, Snow White Blood Red features retellings of classic fairy tales, updated for the 90s by an all-star lineup of authors.
Ellen Datlow is putting together a collection of retellings of fairy tales. And retellings of fairy tales, to me, are very interesting things to do. They're not merely facile exercises, because so many of the basic structures and archetypical characters in fairy tales we're still using. I was just thinking about this last night. One of my favorite science fiction novels is Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. And if you think about the structure of that book, essentially what it is it's a retelling of the fable City Mouse, Country Mouse. And if you remember that, the Aesop's fable, the country mouse is unhappy with the meagerness of the way she has to live, so she goes to visit her opulent cousin in the city, and there's all kinds of riches, but the danger and the hostility and the killing is much greater because there are cats and there are other problems. So eventually she goes back to live in a little meager country, although materially it can't supply her with the things mice need nearly as much. This is The Dispossessed in a nutshell. Shevek leaves Anaris with meager material things to go over to Eurus and discovers that the price is too high in terms of hostility and unfairness and death. And so he returns to his little country mouse.
Right.
And these plots are embedded in us. Well, this is the plots themselves. It's that the plots grow out of something that is embedded in this.
Right.
Whether they're the simpler versions of fairy tales or the more elaborate, quasi-realistic novels that we come to expect in the 20th century. So when I retold Jack and the Beanstalk, which is what The Stalking Beans is retelling, it preserves some of that, and yet you don't just want to tell the whole story straight. And in my version, Jack is a grown-up. He's an adult. He has a wife, and he also has an affair with the giant's wife, who lives at the top of the beanstalk. And essentially the question becomes, since Jack is a former landowner who has now been, due to trickery and machinations, impoverished to the level of a peasant, and the giant's wife furnishes a certain opulence. The question becomes one of haves and have-nots, which is what the original Jack and the Beanstalk was in the first place.
I got asked to do a fairy tale by Ellen Datlow, who is a wonderful editor and a terribly nice person, and she said, Neil, will you do a fairy tale for me? And I said, yeah, okay. And she said, you've got to ask first, because some have been taken, and I don't want to repeat. And I said, fine, has anyone done the Three Billy Goats Gruff? And she said, no. And I said, okay, well, I will. And I wanted to look at, I suppose, the way that links between people break down, and the way people hide under bridges, and what it must be to be a troll these days, and the sort of the spread of urban things. One of the inspirations for it was a path I used to walk down as a kid, which was just a 5-mile walk through the countryside. It was an old railway line after they'd torn up the railway tracks. And it was a walk through nowhere. It was like walking through fairyland. And I went down there recently, and it took hours to even find the path, because there was a huge housing estate covering where it had begun. Even when I found the path, it was, you know, completely, it had turned into a sort of main thoroughfare.
So has the modern world destroyed fairy tales?
I don't think the modern world has destroyed fairy tales at all, but I think the modern world urges a redefinition of fairy tales, and urges the creation of fairy tales that talk about the modern world. Quite how this is to be achieved, I don't know, because I know when I was a kid, and I know that even now, emotionally, I respond much better to a story set in a huge wild wood, and a woodcutter who has 3 sons. I read one thing, sent a book, and it was a psychoanalytic view of mythology written by somebody whose name I've mercifully forgotten. And I sat there and read the whole thing and discovered that Hansel and Gretel was all about sex. And it explained why and how Hansel and Gretel was all about sex. And I got to the end of it and I thought, you know, these were stories written by people who were always hungry. Most of them were suffering from malnutrition. A lot of them never got very much to eat. And you're telling me a story about a woodcutter and his wife who have to get rid of their kids because they don't have enough to eat. There is not enough to eat for the family, so they basically abandon the kids, who then find a house made up of gingerbread, of cake, of good stuff to eat, and then find one of them being fattened up for a witch's dinner, and then they manage to push the witch into the oven and so forth. You tell me this is not about, this is about, it's about food.
It's interesting, when I first mentioned fairy tales, the names that popped to mind were men. The Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, Charles Perrault. I mean, Nancy, can you name one woman associated with pre-20th century folk literature and fairy tales? Thank you. My point is that most of the authors in Snow White, Blood Red and the Xanadu collections are women. Women without feathers. However, when one of the members of Control caught up to Terry Windling, he discovered that women are part of a long fairy tale tradition.
The interesting thing is that the folk tradition was a largely female tradition. This is not true everywhere. Ireland was a place where storytellers were men, and there were a few other places, but largely in Europe, Western tradition anyway, these stories were passed down by women. And they were passed down in large part by unsophisticated country women. And when they were collected by middle-class, white, Victorian men. And they chose which tales they thought were suitable for collection. They changed tales that weren't suitable in their opinion. And so the tales, as we know them, has been filtered through this kind of political agenda before we've gotten them. And to see fairy tales in the ways that centuries of people before us have known them, to understand their real power, you have to dig back into the earlier original tales and to find translations that go back to the older sources.
Let me just zip ahead to where Terry talks about one of those older sources, the Italian version of Sleeping Beauty.
Sleeping Beauty was not awakened with a kiss. She was awakened when she gave birth to twins. So she was impregnated by the prince while she was sleeping. He impregnated her and left. And she's awoken when she gives birth and the twins are suckling at her. And as they're suckling at her body, they at one point suckle on her finger, and that withdraws the splinter and the needle, and then she wakes up. Now, that's a very different version than the one we know, which is, first of all, gone through to Charles Perrault in France, who was a very moralistic man and had kind of tales to teach people in the ways that he retold tales. And then we've gone through the Victorians at the beginning of this century, and then we went through Walt Disney, who again watered it down, so that by the time it gets to modern children, it's really been cleaned up. And you get this all-American high school football jock of a Prince Charming, you know, and this whiter-than-white, totally passive princess. And we only have the bones of the original tale in there.
How important is it to you that we restore the old legend of that? I mean, is there something evil about the Walt Disney version of Sleeping Beauty? Is it a false telling of that story?
I think, in general, it's wrong to water down tales, particular tales that we now say are for children, but that are really for all of us. I think it's wrong to water them down, denying that the dark side of life exists, because one of the things that's so powerful about these tales is that they speak specifically about those darker passages in life and how you either get through them or transform them, how you transform yourself in the process. And by taking away the darkness, making it safe and tame, we lose the ability to use these stories to help us transform our own lives. And I think that's robbing children in particular and our culture in general of a heritage that's ours, a literary heritage.
And it is our literary heritage, because fairy tales are folklore created by ordinary folk. Anne Rice observed that there's no moral sense to fairy tales. Horrible stuff happens for absurd reasons. Well, some fairy tales do have a moral. In fact, as Terry just pointed out, many were rewritten by men to promote a politically correct moral for the politics of the time. But those other stories where horrible, senseless things happen also reflect real life. I mean, there's no moral sense behind cystic fibrosis or earthquakes. And I think that's why fairy tales endure, because even today there are people who suffer at the hands of a jealous stepsister, or have their house blown all the way down, or can't afford to keep their children. In fact, these days, not even the prince and the princess live happily ever after. Next week on Second Nature, the socio-political function of laughter. Can television's comedy quotient be maximized to trigger endorphin release while nullifying psychological damage? Join me and 9 psychiatrists for what promises to be a fun-filled look at whimsy.
Stay tuned.